Welcome to FORSEA Dialogue on Democratic Struggles. We are, a group of Southeast Asia-based or academics and scholars with activist background from Southeast Asia or with concerns for Southeast Asia. I'm Zarni. It is my pleasure and also Professor Rafal Pankowski from Warsaw. He's a sociologist that trained in UK at Oxford and also in Warsaw. He's a well-known author of a number of important works, most relevantly on the rise of new fascisms across Europe, and it was published by the Polish Academy of Sciences about 1998-99, and I have invited him to share his reflections on what has been going on in his country, something that has been a major concern even for some of the NATO allies, such as the United States, that Poland's political directions are moving in a very authoritarian and far-right directions. And so welcome, Rafal.
Hello.
Can you at least, or at the very outset, explain the terminologies that we use: far right, new fascism, neo-fascism, fascisms, because this is one of your areas of expertise, like the study in ideology.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest, as I think most people know, it's not easy to come up with a strict definition for each of these terms. In reality, they are often used simultaneously, and I think it's okay. I mean, it's something that we need to accept and live with. I think the term fascism is probably the most loaded on an emotional level, and of course it symbolizes the criminality of the fascist regimes, and symbolizes, it evokes associations with the fascist and the Nazi crimes of World War II, the Holocaust. So it is a very serious term that must not be applied too lightly. But at the same time, well, I believe, and I suppose you will agree, that there are good reasons for using this term in the period since 1945, when the original historical fascist regimes were defeated. And well, there is a lot of room for discussion here, and there are different definitions flying around, and different approaches pointing to different aspects of fascist and neo-fascist politics. But if I can mention the little book I wrote many years ago that you very, very kindly alluded to, in that book, published by the Polish Academy of Sciences more than 2 decades ago now, I proposed my own definition, which is relatively short and relatively simple, namely fascism as well as neo-fascism can be understood, can be defined as the politics of total cultural homogeneity. And I think this definition is just as good as any other definition of fascism and neo-fascism. Well, that stresses the aspect of the persecution of minorities, the lack of tolerance of any type of minority, be it ethnic, religious, ideological, political, sexual, etc. So the ideal of fascism assumes total uniformity within a certain polity or a certain territory, and I think this is what unites the different the different movements, whether they are historical fascist movements or contemporary neo-fascist movements.
Sorry. Yeah, it is a helpful way to look at, you know, what may constitute as fascist thought. But I'm just, you know, the wondering, it might be helpful to look at some of the behavioral characteristics of a regime that may qualify or that we can, you know, validly call fascist. Say, for instance, like, you know, as you were very much aware, you know, a few months ago, U.S. President Joe Biden, you know, went on national television and, you know, essentially fell just short of like naming Donald Trump and, you know, Trumpish or Trumpism fascist. But he, you know, without defining what it is that the United States is facing as a threat to its democratic institutions and, you know, the existence as a republic. He calls it like, you know, a threat to the republic and the U.S. democracy, right? But without naming, you know, what Trump represents as fascist. But he, you know, quite helpfully characterized, you know, a long list of behavioral traits, you know, and that I was just reading before getting online with you today. The power of the, you know, in all fascist regimes, you have this so-called strong man, the Führer, right? I mean, that's the most, or like, you know, the most recognized term for the fascist leader, the Adolf Hitler. And then like you've got senior fascists, you know, the Mussolini, you know, Mussolini was somebody that Hitler looked up to, you know. When Hitler was nobody, Mussolini was already on the rise as the most powerful man in pre-war Italy, right? And so I think, oh yeah, I saw your note, like your camera was adjusting itself, and so your image comes in a bit blur sometimes, but I think your voice is very, you know, crisp, and so it's okay. So what I'm trying to say is like, you know, this strongman Bolsonaro in Brazil, you've got, you know, in the European neighborhood, Hungary with Viktor Orban, right? And the issue that you mentioned, like this, like cultural and ideological uniformity, you know, the total imposition of one race, one nation, one faith, one social worldview kind of thing, right? And so in the you know, according to the Polish constitution, you've got this like very much a kingly dictatorial model of presidency, right? And he can override whoever you know, the captures presidency through democratic elections, has enormous power, you know, like can, like, you know, overrule the courts, you know, like exercise clemency, you know, you know, and so can you talk about uh, the possibility, if there is any, of democratic processes not necessarily pushing back these fascist extremist tendencies, but facilitating them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, you know, Donald Trump was for the first time, you know, for his first term, he was elected, yeah. And whether he was elected by the popular votes or electoral college vote, that's a different issue, right? But that's the system they have, and so they went with the system, electoral college system, and Trump was declared the winner, you know, in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, right? But in the case of Poland, you don't have the electoral college systems. You've got this popular vote. And so the current president, Duda, claimed in his September interview with the U.S. public broadcasting station when he was in New York for the General Assembly, that everything he's doing is democratically mandated. Although the interviewer Judy from the PBS was telling him that the Poland is going in a far right extreme directions on abortion, on religious tolerance. So can you shed light on how Polish democracy works and why democracy is not enough to push back these extremist far right tendencies?
Well, I think the bottom line here is how we understand democracy, whether we understand it as a set of formal institutions, including the elections. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at democracy is more related to what we can call democratic culture and the democratic values. And I think in the case of Poland, as well as other countries in Europe and outside of Europe, we can definitely observe, we can witness a crisis of democratic culture and democratic values. But let me go back to the first point that you made, which I find very interesting, and I agree with you completely. I think it was since the rise of Trump and Trumpism that the discourse of fascism and anti-fascism has been on the rise too. And I think that is interesting because for many years, not to say decades, people like you and I, people who use the terms such as fascism and anti-fascism, well, we were not necessarily at the center of the public debate, because the public at large didn't believe that fascism is a contemporary challenge. Fascism was seen as something that belongs to history books. And I think that only changed since Trump came to power, and that certainly changed in the US, but also globally. And I think one of several reasons why it happened was the way that Trump himself refers to so-called anti-fascists as the enemy that he himself demonized, and that also came up in the important debate with Biden, when Biden actually explained that anti-fascism is an idea; it is not a single organization. But okay, we understand this is a global issue, the resurgence of political movements, however we call them, far right, xenophobic, authoritarian, or simply neo-fascist. And when it comes to Poland, now let me respond to your question about Poland. One of the big challenges in terms of the discourse we are using is the very important, very fundamental fact that historically Poland was a victim of fascism. It's a country that suffered a lot because of fascism, because of the Nazi occupation, because of World War II. The Jewish population of Poland was almost completely exterminated. Around 3 million Polish Jews died. More than 2 million ethnic Poles and other nationalities living in Poland, such as the Roma, they were also killed or exterminated. And the country suffered enormously. And it is one of the paradoxes, one of the sad paradoxes of Poland today, having a significant far-right movement that in some ways is similar to the fascist movement of the 30s. And that is very confusing to many people outside of Poland, but also inside of Poland. How is it possible that a country that suffered so much has its own far-right and neo-fascist movements? And without going into too much detail on Polish history, I would just mention that Poland had its own fascist groups, such as the National Radical movement in the 1930s, that never came to power, but it existed. And there is a certain continuity between some of those groups that function today and some of the original Polish fascist groups from the 1930s that were anti-Semitic, violent, and totalitarian. Such as the National Radical Camp, the All Polish Youth. There are organizations with the same names existing in Poland today, the same names going back to the 1920s and the 1930s. But I would also add one more important remark. I think that the fascism of today doesn't need the picture of Hitler at the front. It doesn't need the symbolism of the original historic fascist regimes of Italy and Germany, but it can espouse similar ideas, which that makes those contemporary movements dangerous too, even if they don't use the original fascist and Nazi symbolism. So what we have in Poland today is definitely a crisis of democratic culture and democratic values. This crisis manifests itself in different ways, but I think it also results from a very problematic and false assumption that was very common on the part of what we may call the liberal elite of Poland in the 1990s. The assumption about democratization as a one-way street. So, according to this very widespread assumption, Poland would automatically become a more tolerant, a more open society because of European integration, because of the market economy, because opening up of the political system, and so on. And I think, well, you coming from Myanmar, you know something about democratization not being a one-way street, and we can of course point to other examples, but that assumption was very common, and I think by now we know well that it was wrong. So democratic culture cannot be taken for granted. Progressive values cannot be taken for granted. And one of the big challenges that we face today is especially when we talk about democratic culture and democratic values among the younger generation. So people who were often born and raised in a democratic society, who could be expected to be, well, automatically more open-minded, more tolerant, more progressive. That is not necessarily the case. And we see that some of the contemporary far-right movements in Poland, including the extremist groups I mentioned, they have support among young people, especially young men. So there is also a gender dimension here. It is the young men, especially, who are often prone to extreme nationalism and far-right ideas. So that is one of the important dimensions of the current crisis of democratic culture in Poland, I believe.
I think that you put it rather lucidly and very helpfully. You know, when you separate democracy as an electoral process, a technical behavior, right? People go to the polls and the polling booths and then cast their vote, right? And then whoever gets the greatest number of like votes, get to take over the state power, right? But then also, like you also mentioned, that that process alone is not a sufficient condition for a more humane, sort of more compassionate type of a democracy, because like there are people that that argue that democracy may be or is definitely a majoritarian rule, but with safeguards for minority rights, and then like just simply because there there is like 20%, 10% minority who disagree with the majority, doesn't mean the majority can do anything it wants against the interest and well-being of that minority, whether it's a sexual minority, cultural, religious minority, ethnic minorities, or even like political minority, right? And so I think that's a really, really helpful way of understanding why democratic elections and formal democratic processes alone are not enough to create a non-fascist, majoritarian democracy, right? Also, what I like about your previous chunk of explanation is that people expected a country like Poland that has suffered so much under Nazi rule, foreign interventions from Russia, right? Because Poland was sandwiched between different powers, and you were sliced off, among different external invaders. The How could a people that have suffered so much under fascism itself or themselves become or begin to act like oppressive, repressive, fascist, or far right, whatever you call it, right?
Mm.
So I think like there are quite a few examples. I mean, Angela Davis, whose work or whom you would know, that has made the similar observation, saying that formerly persecuted or oppressed communities, yeah, when they have political power and when they have freedom, they begin to behave like new oppressor, new repressive power. She mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi as an example, as an individual example, and the Burmese public that participated in the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in my country. And of course, her prime example is Israel. How could a country that have drawn so much cultural capital from the Holocaust turn itself into this officially apartheid, right? Jewish state, against the non-Jewish population of the Arabs and others, right? So I think like, so that is why it's difficult for those of us who are not Poles or who are not Israelis to use the terminology fascist to these places, even when we know that by looking at the characteristic behaviors of all fascist authoritarian regimes, countries like Poland come to qualify as basically a fascist majority, right? I mean, this is a sad and perhaps even offensive like observation to so many Polish people, but no one wants to be called fascist. Even fascists don't want to be called fascist unless they are hardcore SS, right? So the what concerns me is that the news I have read that even your organization, you're also like one of the major founders and players behind Never Again Association, and you engage with young Polish populations, like students, for instance, young activists, trying to educate them about the perils of racism and whatnot. But your organization is banned from district of Krakow, Auschwitz, from teaching about racism and genocidal racism. Can you tell us what is happening? This is outrageous.
Well, thank you for this question. But before I answer this specific question, let me just say that we can maybe disagree on specific assessments of the situation in different places, be it Israel or elsewhere. But I think what we will agree on is definitely the fact that suffering is not a vaccination against xenophobia or authoritarianism. That is very clear. And I think, of course, we would need to be very careful about national generalizations, because they are always risky. But I think Poland gives a lot of examples of that, unfortunately. And the case you just mentioned, yes, it's a real story that became known several months ago. The regional authority of the Krakow region, Małopolska, the south of Poland, which includes Oświęcim, which is known internationally as Auschwitz. The authority came up with a long list of civil society organizations that are not welcome or effectively prohibited from organizing educational activities in schools in that whole region. And that list includes Never Again. It also includes many feminist and LGBT rights groups. But it also includes the Roma Association of Poland, and it also includes the Auschwitz Jewish Center. So I would say, in this sense, we are in good company here. And I think this is a fact that illustrates quite well everything that we have talked about. So the rise of authoritarianism, that in this case manifests itself in the form of pressure on the educational system. And it clearly reflects the hostility against different types of minorities or different types of civil society groups that challenge the sort of far-right ideology that currently dominates the educational system in Poland. And in the last years, especially the LGBT community has been targeted by the ruling party. But we also have examples of hate speech against other groups, such as Jews or Muslims. And the Never Again Association for many years has documented cases of hate speech and physical hate crimes against different communities. Certainly since 2015, we have seen a big rise in those cases. But there is one more thing that is important for Poland, but not just for Poland, that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is the role of communication and the role of big tech and the role of social media platforms that in many ways enables hate speech to go unchallenged and to influence people on a scale that was not imaginable just several years ago. And well, we have participated in several research projects, such as Get the Trolls Out project. And we have seen that in many cases, hate speech on the biggest social media and the biggest big tech platforms in the Polish language is tolerated by the big companies against their own terms of service, supposedly. And again, I think, obviously, we know the case of Facebook in Myanmar, and we know several other cases that have been discussed in the last years that show something similar. Well, the big social media platforms can be, can be very useful in enabling communication on a global scale, but they can also be very dangerous, enabling hate speech on a huge scale. And we have seen this phenomenon in Poland too. But if I may add one more important part of context to our conversation, of course, it is the context of the war in Ukraine, which is just next door to Poland. And I think in some ways it really shows us that the phrase "never again" has a much more dramatic and contemporary meaning than we would have expected when we started "Never Again" in 1996. So it also shows that the politics of fascism, the politics of authoritarianism, ultimately it leads to war, it leads to violence and human suffering on a mass scale. And one important aspect of the ongoing war for Poland is the refugee issue. Several million Ukrainian refugees are in Poland today. And I think this is also a paradox because, well, historically Poland was one of the most diverse countries in the whole of Europe until World War II, until the Holocaust. Until recently, it was one of the most mono-ethnic, monocultural societies in Europe. That is changing again just this year under dramatic circumstances. Because of the war in Ukraine and because of the refugees from Ukraine, and I think many of them will stay in Poland for a long time, maybe forever. And I think for the Polish society, this is another challenge: how to deal with a group of several million people from another country who now live with us, who are our neighbors, who are our colleagues, our friends, and this is a new situation that is also exploited by some far-right groups who try to incite hostility against the refugees, and that happens on social media and in other places. And we have also documented this in a recent report by the Never Again Association. I think until now, there is a lot of solidarity and sympathy for the refugees in Polish society, which has to be recognized and appreciated. As a frequent critic of my own society, I can say, well, this is something that makes me really proud, and I think it is good to cherish and maintain this kind of solidarity. But of course, there are also groups actively working to change that and to promote hostility against the refugees. But well, I think that shows that these topics are not just abstract discussions. These are very real challenges and very real problems.
Yeah, I think that gives us a good segue into this issue of the differential or different, radically different treatment of or receptions or lack of it of different refugees, right? Because as a member of the European Union and also, of course, NATO, during the Afghan and Syrian refugee crisis, that the Germany of Chancellor Merkel opened its borders and embracing I don't know, maybe like 200,000 Syrian refugees with skills or no skills, families, children, right? And then some may argue that the German economy could absorb, you know, such influx because of Germans, labor needs, right? But at the time, Poland was assigned or asked to take about 10,000 Syrian refugees, something around that ballpark figure by the European Union, and the Polish state, countered that assignment by saying, Poland doesn't have enough space, and so, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Poland had absorbed or welcomed, in some cases with classical music, flowers, and free ride, are inviting, like, Ukrainian refugee families into their homes. All of that is good and welcome, but the contrast, on the part of the Polish state and Polish society, in terms of their reception and rejection, like on one hand, the Poland said not enough space for 10,000 Syrians, and presumably predominantly Muslims and of different cultures from the Middle East, and then, like, next door neighbor, 3 million, all of a sudden Poland found instant spaces for Ukrainian refugees. And, like, without, to state the obvious, even, like, the Western medias like BBC and others to say, hey, look, there are humans, and then, they're European and white and Christian, and they must not face war, and, Europe is not the place for war. We're about peace. But, like Syrians and Iraqi and Afghanis, like, war is part of their life. And so, so can you explain why this seismic shift, because like countries like Hungary under Orban is categorically anti-immigration, anti-refugees. And then the same could be said about pre-Ukraine war Poland. What changed?
Well, you're right to point out there is a big paradox here, because the Polish ruling party, Law and Justice, which until recently was one of the most anti-migrant, anti-refugee ruling parties in the whole of Europe, now this year they're presiding over the biggest refugee movement in modern history. That is very paradoxical. More than 6 million people from Ukraine crossed the Polish border. Not all of them stayed in Poland. Some of them came back. Some of them went to other countries, but a majority probably are in Poland, and that is a big group of people in a country of 38 million. Some Polish cities, such as Warsaw, increased their population by close to 20%. But there are other cities, such as Rzeszów in the southeast of Poland, that increased its population by more than 50%. And that's a huge number, of course, by any standards. So it is a paradox, and it is also correct to point out that the treatment of other refugees has been less welcoming, to say the least, especially the Muslim refugees from the Middle East, and certainly Islamophobia played a big role in that in the years since 2015. But it is also good to mention that according to some estimates, up to 10% of the refugees from Ukraine have been non-Ukrainian nationals, and in many cases that means students from countries of Africa and Asia who studied in Ukrainian universities. They were accepted as refugees in Poland. They do not have the same status as Ukrainian nationals, but they were allowed to cross the border, which I think is the important thing to acknowledge as well. Of course, there were reports of discrimination on the Polish-Ukrainian border, especially in the first days and weeks of the chaos of the war. But I think I would repeat, overall, the wave of solidarity with the refugees is overwhelming, and I would see it as a positive. I would see this as something that really needs to be appreciated, and of course we should advocate for the standards of treatment of the other refugees from other conflict zones, other wars, other countries to be raised. We should not imply that the Ukrainians should be treated less well in order to achieve equal treatment, equally bad treatment of all the refugees. That of course would be wrong, a wrong conclusion. But I completely agree. We should definitely advocate for the standards to be raised, at least to the level that the level of treatment that the Ukrainian refugees have had in Poland and in other European countries.
No, absolutely, I agree. The Polish society and governments are welcoming of refugees, and support that has been given to the the 3 million Ukrainians. Is commendable, and of course, like this is a kind of behavior that we want to see on the part of any society and state, like extended to people in need, irrespective of their faith or religion or geographic origins, right? So in the last 10 or so minutes that we have left, I want to ask you the one fundamental question, well, two actually. One is but they're related, the treatment of the woman in terms of their rights, their right to control their lives. That includes a bit the legal and moral right to decide what they want to do with their bodies. Yeah, not simply abortion, but women make up half of the world's population, and virtually every single institution that societies has invented attempts to control women, and more than men, right? And so, what is the status of the rights of women in Poland, right? And we saw what happened with the reversal of Roe versus Wade. The U.S. Supreme Court regressive and Neanderthal, attack on women's rights, right? After 40 years or so, that reversal took place in no small part because of the so-called Christian right, far-right Christians who attempt to impose their values and worldview on the rest of the society, believers or not, right? And then the second and related question is, what is the role of the Catholic Church in society and politics? As you well know, the fascist atrocities during the Second World War, both in the Balkans, they say, for instance, like Croatia, and also in Nazi Germany, were aided and abetted by the church itself at the highest level, right? And in Croatia, 600,000 estimated, victims like Roma, Sinti, sexual minorities, communists, as well as the Jewish people, were slaughtered, right? Like, Croatia was known, Yasinova, that's the place, right? And that's the second, largest after Auschwitz, in terms of killing fields. But this was done in the name of, Catholicism and Catholic nationalism. So two questions: the status of women's rights and the role of Catholic Church in Poland moving in this very sad and scary far-right direction.
Mhm. Well, I completely agree. These two questions are directly related. Certainly, we already alluded to briefly to the gender aspect of far-right authoritarianism, and that is also a global phenomenon for sure. But I would add that um, I would add that in the Polish context, the role of the Roman Catholic Church is crucial. And well, Poland is a majority Catholic society, but it would be wrong to assume that every Pole is a Catholic. It is much more complex and complicated historically as well as today. But I think the Catholic Church or Catholicism often serves as a marker of identity, a marker of ethno-national identity. Maybe sometimes in similar ways to the way Buddhism functions in Myanmar.
And Thailand as well.
Absolutely. So it is also very clear that there are far-right groups and power centers within the Catholic Church in Poland, which are very influential, such as Radio Maria, which is a radio station, but it's also a hardline far-right social movement that was built around it over the last 3 decades. And those groups have a lot of influence also on the level of politics. And I would say the abortion issue is of course a very spectacular example of that. Well, one of the side results of that decision, of that ruling, is the fact that young women have protested on a mass scale. It was women as well as men, but it was the young women who have been at the heart of the protest. And I think it would be very difficult for the far right to win back the support of that demographic group. So in a way, that was a big win for the far right, especially for the fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Catholics. But there is also a setback for the far right in terms of losing one important group in society that is now against it. But like I said before, young men still remain the main basis for the support of the far right groups, such as the All Polish Youth. But young women today are much less prone to supporting such groups and such ideas.
Right. Yeah. Very, very, very finally, you know, you specialized in the study of ideologies, especially fascism. I've been to Krakow quite a few times, and as well as Warsaw, and took the time to see the museums and whatnot. And the Poland, as you rightly said, was one of the most culturally and intellectually vibrant European civilizations, right? And the Krakow before the Holocaust was the home to the largest and the most vibrant Jewish community, right? 70,000 plus Jews there. Made enormous contributions, but the I guess like 95% of the Jewish population of Krakow and Poland as a whole were quote unquote liquidated or exterminated, right? And so you say like today's far right groups have a visible historical ties to the past, right? And so the recently I was talking to two scholars and observers of Sweden and Italy. Italy now has an officially far-right government, but the brothers of Italy, and then you got in Sweden the Swedish Democrats, right? And that's now like they're the second largest, right? Then you've got in France, Marie Le Pen is waiting in the wing because the Macron won't be able to run for the third time, and there's no serious challenger from the center or the liberal or against the Le Pen's power base. So how do you see the future of these far right slash fascist movements across Europe? Like we've got in Asia, like India is going that direction. Latin America, particularly Brazil, we're going to have a runoff between Lula and Bolsonaro on the 31st of October. And then like if Trump is able to run in 2024, the US is in deep, deep trouble, right? Because it's not just the strong men, but the strong populist base, right? So if you, to put all of these ingredients together, what do you see as the future of fascism? If fascism has a future, and we as the people who want to live in peace with diverse communities, we don't have a future. We cannot have a fascism with a future. What do you see the future of fascism? Where is it heading?
Well, of course, it is a very important question and a very difficult one to answer. But well, let me say that we definitely witness growing internationalization of the far right, which is in a way paradoxical because they portray themselves as nationalists while being very interconnected on an international and global level, including all the different movements and leaders that you have just listed. And I think the challenge is very real, but the outcome is far from certain in any way. So I would say the future is unwritten, and it really depends on us as citizens of our countries, as citizens of the planet, to decide collectively what the future will be. I don't know if that really answers the big question, but I think that the answer is still open.
Yeah, I think what the people from the progressive communities around the world have been talking about is some kind of progressive international, right? And what we end up dealing with is essentially this gelling of different fascist movements, paradoxically, into a fascist international. You see what I mean? They are moving into state institutions, taking over, changing laws, poisoning the culture, poisoning the minds of the new generation, and so. But it's been really enlightening to hear your thoughts, and it's thanks for giving a very nuanced and layered, analysis of your own country. And you've been listening to Professor Rafal Pankowski, this well-known sociologist and also an activist, fighting against different types of racism. Thank you, Rafal. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure. I appreciate.